They said she was untouchable, and the plantations of Oklahoma soon learned why. Her name was whispered in fear and awe among both captives and masters alike, a single syllable carrying the weight of terror, the woman who refused to be broken. She was small in stature but immense in defiance, a living storm cloaked in the skin of a human. Any master who dared to claim her as property in the most intimate sense paid the price in blood and humiliation. By the time the sun rose over the red earth of the fields, her reputation had already spread like wildfire. 3 masters, 3 acts of audacious self-defense, and a lesson carved into the minds of all who thought they could possess her body. Born into a world that had already decided her fate, she entered the plantation not as a victim, but as a force waiting to erupt. Her childhood, marked by the chains of slavery, should have taught her fear, but instead, it honed her instincts. She learned the paths of the fields, the weaknesses in the overseer's routines, and the fleeting moments when she could move unseen. Every glance, every whispered command from those above her became a map of opportunity. She discovered early that survival was not merely endurance, but the mastery of anticipation, courage, and calculated retaliation. And when the boundaries of her body were challenged, she transformed fear into fury, asserting a dominance that few could comprehend. Her first confrontation with a master set the precedent that would define her legend. The man, swollen with arrogance and the assumed entitlement of his class, underestimated the fire within her. In the isolation of the quarters, where shadows clung to walls and the cries of other captives were swallowed by the night, she struck. His audacity met its equal in her precision and resolve. Word of this act spread quickly, carried by the hush of fearful whispers among the enslaved. What should have been punishment became the first brick in the fortress of her infamy. The plantation trembled under the weight of her audacity, and the notion that she could be dominated was shattered irrevocably. Yet, her story was not merely one of singular acts of violence. It was the tale of a woman navigating the impossible terrain of oppression with cunning, strategy, and unyielding self-respect. In the world of the plantations, where every tool, every whip, and every law was designed to subjugate, she became a master of the unspoken rules. She learned when to retreat, when to watch, and when to strike. Her power was not only physical but psychological. Fear became her ally, a weapon she wielded as deftly as her own hands. Stories of her deeds circulated in secret, serving both as caution and inspiration. She had transformed the most brutal circumstances into a realm where her autonomy could exist, however fleetingly. What made her story unforgettable, however, was the combination of defiance and survival. Many would have crumbled under the weight of constant threat, yet she endured. 3 masters, each more arrogant and cruel than the last, attempted to violate her body, and each met a consequence so severe that the plantation itself seemed to recognize her power. The audacity of her resistance created a paradox. She was a slave in law, yet a sovereign in spirit. Even those tasked with enforcing submission learned caution, understanding that beneath the veneer of bondage lay a mind as sharp as any overseer's strategy and a body unwilling to surrender. Her legend did not remain confined to the plantations themselves. Across the red clay fields and the marshes of Oklahoma, her story became folklore, carried by those who had witnessed or merely heard the whispers. Mothers warned their children to respect the fire that lived in the hearts of the enslaved, to remember that defiance could take many forms and that some women were untouchable in ways that transcended law, whip, or threat. She embodied the paradox of slavery itself, a system designed to erase, control, and diminish, yet one that could not contain the spirit of those who refused to be broken. By the time her deeds were etched into memory, she had become more than a woman. She was a symbol, a storm of courage and survival that haunted the minds of masters and empowered the hearts of captives. Her actions carved out a sliver of freedom in a world determined to deny it, leaving a mark on history both brutal and magnificent. To hear her name was to remember the impossible truth. Even in chains, there are those who refuse to be conquered, and her legend would endure long after the fields fell silent. From the moment she first set foot on the fields of the Oklahoma plantation, she understood that survival would demand more than endurance. It would demand ferocity, cunning, and an uncompromising assertion of her autonomy. In a world where every whip, every command, every shadowed glance of a master carried the implicit threat of bodily violation, she recognized a truth that most enslaved women learned too late. The body is the final frontier, the last domain over which one might claim sovereignty. And so, she armed herself not with weapons fashioned from iron or stone, but with the very instrument that the oppressors sought to dominate, her own flesh and strength. Her first act of ruthless self-defense was an event that would ripple through the plantation for years to come. A master, swollen with arrogance and the entitlement that centuries of systemic oppression had instilled in him, believed that his position allowed him absolute access, both public and private. He underestimated her. In the dimly lit quarters of the slave cabins, where the moonlight spilled across rough-hewn floors and shadows stretched like silent witnesses, she struck. Her movements were precise, rapid, and merciless. The man's audacity collided with her unflinching resolve, and the consequences were immediate and horrifying. This was not a mere act of rebellion. It was a declaration that her body was no longer property, that no social law, plantation custom, or threat could claim it without consequence. The immediacy of her retaliation was only part of the terror she inspired. She transformed fear into strategy. Her acts were not random, they were carefully calculated, designed to ensure that the lessons learned would echo far beyond the immediate victim. When she struck, she did so with visibility others were meant to see to comprehend the risk of violation. Her reputation grew not merely from the violence she enacted, but from the psychological resonance it left in the minds of observers. Fellow captives learned to whisper her name with awe, while masters began to measure the arrogance of their advances against the risk of public humiliation or worse. In this way, she wielded fear as adeptly as any weapon forged from iron, her body the instrument through which power was asserted. What makes this keynote particularly significant is the context in which it unfolded. The Oklahoma plantations of her time were brutal, marked by systemic dehumanization, physical abuse, and sexual predation. Masters often treated enslaved women as expendable, their autonomy dismissed entirely. To resist in such circumstances was to invite punishment, often deadly. Yet she defied these odds. Her self-defense was not merely a reaction, it was an act of audacious agency. Each confrontation became a lesson in the risks of underestimating a spirit that refused to bend. Her ferocity was coupled with intelligence. She studied her oppressors, understood their weaknesses, and exploited them at precisely the right moment. Survival and defiance became indistinguishable in her strategy. Her reputation was further amplified by the systemic fear she instilled. Masters who had witnessed or heard of her retaliation quickly realized that she could not be approached lightly. The physicality of her response was undeniable, but it was the mythic aura that surrounded her that cemented her status. She became a figure both real and symbolic, a woman whose defiance suggested that some forms of power could not be confined by law, custom, or force. Among the enslaved community, she was a figure of whispered admiration, a beacon of resistance in a world that sought to render women powerless. Her actions provided a template for self-preservation, teaching that courage, even in the most oppressive circumstances, could carve out small, sacred spaces of autonomy. Psychologically, the impact of her self-defense extended beyond immediate survival. By taking decisive action against those who sought to violate her, she reclaimed not only her body, but her sense of agency. The plantation system relied on terror and subjugation, but she subverted this structure, demonstrating that even under the harshest oppression, one could assert control over the self. This reclamation was radical. In a society designed to erase her will, she forged a domain of inviolability around her body. It was a quiet rebellion, one that did not merely oppose her oppressors, but transformed her into a symbol of defiance. The acts themselves were brutal and precise. When the second and third masters attempted to assert their dominance, she repeated her strategy, each time ensuring that the consequences were unmistakable. Her methods were calculated to inflict maximum deterrent effect while preserving her own survival. Each act reinforced her growing reputation. She was not merely defending herself, She was sending a message across the plantation that she was a force to be respected and feared. Physical retaliation, in this context, became a language of authority. Every master who considered violating her had to weigh not just desire against law, but desire against potential humiliation, injury, or death. Among the enslaved, her actions carried moral and cultural significance. They were not just demonstrations of personal courage, they were acts that challenged the structure of power itself. In a society designed to diminish women, to make their bodies instruments of labor and sexual gratification, she declared an unassailable right to self-possession. Her legend grew not merely because she struck back, but because she struck with precision, ensuring that her body remained hers and hers alone. The fear she inspired was not rooted solely in violence, but in the unflinching assertion of autonomy within a world constructed to erase it. By the end of her first decade on the plantation, she had become more than a woman. She had become a symbol of resistance. The stories of her self-defense were passed along like sacred texts, whispered among cabins and fields, teaching that even in chains, there were moments of sovereignty that could not be denied. Masters and captives alike understood that she had transformed herself into a living, breathing warning. Those who sought to dominate without consequence would meet a reckoning. Her body, once thought to be a site of subjugation, had become the very instrument of her power. In conclusion, this keynote illustrates the extraordinary intersection of survival, defiance, and legend. She transformed physical self-defense into psychological authority, turning fear into strategy and oppression into resistance. The brutality of her acts was only part of the story. Their calculated precision, cultural impact, and enduring legacy ensured that her name would become synonymous with fearless autonomy. She was, in every sense, a woman who weaponized her body to reclaim the most fundamental right denied to her by society, the right to control herself, and in doing so, she left a mark on history that would echo far beyond the fields of her Oklahoma plantation. In the unforgiving expanse of Oklahoma's plantations, survival was never a certainty. Life under the shadow of slavery was a daily battle against hunger, violence, and dehumanization, and for women, the stakes were exponentially higher. She learned this truth early in her life. The cruel laws of the plantations were designed to strip the enslaved of every vestige of agency, leaving them defenseless against the whims of masters and overseers alike. Yet, from the very first day she set foot on that red clay soil, it became clear that she would not succumb. Survival, for her, was not merely the avoidance of death, it was the assertion of intelligence, resourcefulness, and calculated defiance. She understood that in a system built on oppression, those who survived were those who could see, anticipate, and manipulate the forces around them without succumbing to fear. Her survival was a delicate balance of observation and action. Every morning as the sun rose over the fields, she memorized the movements of her masters and overseers, noting which corners of the plantation were left unsupervised, which routes through the fields allowed her a moment of autonomy, and which allies among the enslaved could be relied upon for support. The plantation was a living organism of hierarchy, and she navigated it as one would navigate a storm-tossed sea, careful, deliberate, and always anticipating the next wave of threat. Her intelligence became as much a weapon as her physical strength, allowing her to avoid pitfalls that might have doomed others less observant or less cunning. It was not enough merely to evade danger, she also had to assert dominance over those who threatened her. This was particularly true in a landscape where masters assumed that every enslaved woman was theirs to command. Her reputation for ruthless self-defense preceded her, but maintaining it required constant vigilance and a keen understanding of human psychology. She observed the weaknesses in her oppressors, their overconfidence, their ignorance, their reliance on fear as a tool of control, and exploited them with precision. Every encounter became a game of anticipation. She knew when to submit, when to retreat, and, most importantly, when to strike. In this way, she transformed the very system designed to crush her into a battlefield on which she could assert her will. Her cunning was matched by a relentless audacity. Each act of survival was deliberate, a calculated risk that could mean life or death. She understood that hesitation or passivity would result in victimization, and she refused to allow fear to dictate her actions. Her courage was not reckless, It was honed by necessity, tempered by the understanding that the stakes were unrelentingly high. She struck when the moment presented itself, exploiting opportunities that others might overlook. She learned to manipulate the expectations of her oppressors, turning their assumptions of control into traps for them, and in doing so, carved out a space of autonomy within an environment designed to deny it. Part of her survival depended on building and maintaining subtle networks of influence. Among the enslaved, she cultivated alliances, sharing information and resources while maintaining the respect and awe that her fearsome reputation demanded. She understood that survival was communal as well as personal. Information about the movements of overseers, the hidden threats of masters, and the shifting dynamics of the plantation could mean the difference between life and death. Her intelligence extended beyond immediate threats to encompass the broader ecosystem of the plantation. In this way, she became both a leader and a protector, using her insight to navigate the treacherous social landscape and ensure that she, and sometimes others, remained one step ahead of danger. Physical strength played a role, but it was always guided by strategy. She conserved her energy, striking only when necessary, and ensuring that her actions carried maximum impact. Her confrontations were precise, leaving no room for hesitation or error. The acts that earned her legendary status, the punishment of masters who dared violate her, were as much a product of foresight and planning as of courage and physicality. Survival demanded that she balance aggression with discretion, defiance with prudence, and vengeance with restraint. Every decision was weighed against the cost of failure, and she emerged as someone whose mastery of this balance became central to her enduring legend. Her ability to survive against impossible odds also reflected her understanding of the psychological dimension of slavery. She recognized that fear was as much a weapon as any whip or chain. By cultivating an aura of invincibility, she made potential threats hesitate, reconsider, or abandon their attempts at domination. Masters who might have acted on impulse found themselves calculating, uncertain, and ultimately restrained by the legend she had created through repeated demonstrations of strength, intelligence, and audacity. She weaponized perception, turning the fears of others into a protective shield. Yet, perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of her survival was her ability to remain human amidst the dehumanization surrounding her. She did not merely react to cruelty, she observed, learned, and adapted. She retained her sense of identity and agency even when the world sought to erase both. Her survival was therefore not only physical but moral and psychological, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit even under relentless oppression. Every day she lived, every act of cunning, defiance, and foresight was a triumph over a system designed to deny her selfhood entirely. By the end of her years on the plantation, her survival was legendary. She had defied masters, outwitted overseers, and created a realm of autonomy within a system intent on total control. Her name inspired both fear and respect. Her deeds whispered across cabins and fields as examples of what could be achieved through intelligence, courage, and audacity. Survival against the odds had become not just a necessity, but a craft, one she mastered to perfection. In conclusion, her story of survival against the odds demonstrates the extraordinary capacity of human intelligence and courage under extreme oppression. She navigated a world designed to destroy her, using wit, strength, psychological insight, and audacity to not only endure but assert a measure of sovereignty. Her legend, built on these acts of survival, became a beacon of fear, respect, and inspiration, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, ingenuity, courage, and determination can transform life-threatening oppression into a narrative of resilience and power. In the sweltering heat of the Oklahoma plantations, stories traveled faster than the wind through the fields, and the whispers of the enslaved carried a weight that could unsettle even the most hardened overseer. Among these tales, hers became a story both feared and revered, a woman whose deeds of defiance were so extraordinary that even her fellow captives spoke of them only in hushed tones, careful not to attract attention, careful not to invite the wrath of those who wielded chains and whips. Her power extended beyond brute force or physical retaliation. It was psychological, subtle, and pervasive. She created not just a reputation but a network of silence, an unspoken agreement among those around her that some things were to be neither questioned nor revealed. The blood pact of silence began almost imperceptibly. Captives who had witnessed her first acts of self-defense, the swift punishment of a master who had overstepped his authority, recognized the danger of discussion. They understood that recounting the tale aloud might bring consequences not only to themselves but to her, and so they spoke softly, their voices dropping when her name was mentioned, and their eyes darting to ensure that no overseer overheard. But what began as fear quickly transformed into reverence. Her authority became more than physical. It was a cultural and psychological force that demanded compliance even without direct confrontation. The silent pact she cultivated allowed her to operate with a level of autonomy unusual in the world of slavery, turning fear into both shield and weapon. This unspoken code had profound implications for the plantation's social dynamics. While masters wielded law and violence to maintain control, she wielded secrecy and silence. By compelling those around her to respect the unspoken boundaries she set, she created a zone of protection. Captives who were loyal to her, or who simply feared the consequences of disobedience, became her allies in preserving her autonomy. They did not need to fight for her. They needed only to observe the rules of silence. This quiet complicity amplified her power, extending it beyond her own physical actions and ensuring that the plantation hierarchy was subtly but unmistakably disrupted. The effectiveness of this silent pact lay in its psychological precision. Fear, when reinforced through careful observation and subtle intimidation, becomes a powerful regulator of behavior. Captives learned that the stories they whispered were not idle gossip but warnings, and that deviation from this silent understanding could have immediate and severe consequences. Masters, too, began to notice that attempts to assert sexual or physical dominance over her were met with unpredictability and risk. She had transformed the very notion of power. Whereas oppression depended on overt threat and coercion, her authority relied on perception, anticipation, and the quiet complicity of those who observed her actions. What is remarkable about the blood pact of silence is that it was not enforced through explicit threat or punishment alone. While she was fully capable of physical retribution, much of her control stemmed from her ability to inspire awe and caution. Captives who witnessed her first acts of defiance, swift, precise, and brutal, understood the potential consequences of revealing too much or speaking carelessly. Over time, her reputation alone maintained the pact. Stories were passed along cabin walls and over fieldwork in hushed tones, teaching new arrivals that her name was to be spoken only with respect and caution. This culture of silence became a shield, protecting her from both immediate retaliation and long-term threats to her autonomy. The blood pact of silence also had a moral and communal dimension. By compelling discretion, she ensured the safety of others as well as herself. Captives who shared information recklessly risked bringing punishment upon themselves or the wider community. Her careful cultivation of secrecy created an environment in which her deeds could inspire without endangering others unnecessarily. It was an early form of strategic resistance, one that demonstrated a profound understanding of the social dynamics within the plantation system. In enforcing silence, she not only preserved her autonomy, but also created a subtle structure of protection for those who surrounded her. This approach allowed her to operate with remarkable freedom within the otherwise rigid and oppressive confines of the plantation. Whereas most enslaved individuals had little opportunity to assert control, she carved out a space in which her influence was unquestioned. The pact of silence ensured that even those who might have been tempted to expose her actions hesitated, aware that the risks far outweighed the potential benefit. Masters, meanwhile, were confronted with the unsettling reality that her power extended beyond the physical. The fear she inspired could not be ignored, measured, or easily suppressed. Her legend became self-reinforcing, growing stronger with each whispered recounting of her deeds. The psychological impact of this unspoken authority cannot be overstated. Fear is a powerful motivator, and when combined with reverence and respect, it can create a level of control that rivals any physical enforcement. Captives, even while laboring under the harshest conditions, understood that her name carried consequences that transcended immediate action. Silence became her tool, her ally, and her defense. Through it, she maintained a degree of autonomy and respect that was otherwise unattainable in a system designed to strip enslaved women of both. Ultimately, the blood pact of silence elevated her from a mere survivor to a figure of legend. Her story endured not only because of her physical courage, but because of the psychological mastery she demonstrated. She was a woman who understood that power could be exercised without violence alone, and that perception, fear, and discretion could be as formidable as any whip or chain. The quiet obedience she inspired among her fellow captives and the caution she instilled in masters alike ensured that her authority remained unchallenged, that her legend continued to grow, and that her story would be passed down for generations. In conclusion, the blood pact of silence exemplifies her genius as a survivor, a strategist, and a leader in a world designed to deny her both agency and autonomy. By compelling discretion, cultivating awe, and enforcing unspoken rules of behavior, she transformed fear into power and isolation into influence. Her ability to create an unchallenged sphere of authority within the confines of a brutal and dehumanizing system is a testament to her intelligence, courage, and foresight. It is through this pact, whispered among the oppressed and feared by the oppressors, that her legend was solidified, a dark, enduring symbol of resistance in the face of impossible odds. In the unforgiving landscape of Oklahoma's plantations, reputation was as vital a survival tool as strength or cunning. For enslaved individuals, a name whispered in fear could mean the difference between life and death. In the case of the woman who would become known as the most dangerous female slave, her reputation did not merely precede her, it became an invisible fence, a psychological barrier that dissuaded any who might seek to exploit or harm her. It is one thing to defend oneself in the moment of attack, but to transform those defensive acts into a living, breathing legend that protects you even in your absence, that is a feat few could accomplish, and yet she did it with terrifying precision. Her reputation was not born of rumor alone, but was forged in repeated acts of daring defiance. Each master who attempted to assert control over her body, each overseer who tried to bend her to the will of the plantation hierarchy, met with swift and unforgettable punishment. These acts were not random. They were calculated to instill fear, to demonstrate that transgression would be met with consequence, and that her autonomy was not negotiable. The physicality of her retaliation was shocking, but it was the psychological imprint, the sheer audacity and precision of her actions, that solidified her standing. Stories of her deeds traveled quickly, carried on hushed lips across cabins, fields, and even among the masters themselves, creating a pervasive aura of caution that extended far beyond the moment of confrontation. Masters who were accustomed to wielding near-absolute power found themselves confronted with an unprecedented problem, a slave whose reputation alone could prevent assault before it was attempted. Unlike other enslaved individuals whose punishment often reinforced submission through fear, she used fear strategically, establishing boundaries that few dared to test. Plantation owners who might have dismissed rumors of her ferocity soon found themselves reconsidering their actions, calculating the risks of crossing her against the potential humiliation, injury, or even death. Her reputation, in essence, became a living barrier, a deterrent more effective than chains, locks, or overseers' whips. The spread of her reputation also highlights the importance of storytelling within enslaved communities. The act of whispering her deeds in cabins, during fieldwork, or under the cover of night, was both a form of cautionary tale and a means of preserving her legacy. Each retelling emphasized her cunning, precision, and indomitable spirit, reinforcing her aura of untouchable authority. Fear became a currency, and she traded in it expertly. Masters who might have been tempted to act impulsively were reminded, through hearsay, that this was a woman who did not yield, a woman whose response was swift and exacting. Her reputation became a deterrent not through law or force, but through perception, a psychological mastery that few could counter. Her effectiveness in creating this reputation relied on both visibility and selectivity. She ensured that her acts of defiance were witnessed or discovered by those whose knowledge would spread the story most effectively. Yet, she was also discreet, careful not to provoke mass retaliation that could threaten her life. This balance required keen insight. She had to assess which actions would enhance her standing and which might invite catastrophic consequences. Her intelligence in managing these social dynamics demonstrates a level of strategic thinking rarely recorded among enslaved women in the historical record, yet essential for survival in such perilous circumstances. The psychological dimension of her reputation extended to the enslaved themselves. By commanding respect through fear and audacity, she established herself as a figure of authority even among her peers. They learned that aligning with her, or at the very least, not challenging her, was essential to their own safety. Her name became shorthand for caution, a symbol that the boundaries she drew around her body and her autonomy were not to be crossed. In this sense, she did not merely defend herself, she created a framework of respect and power within the plantation system that few others could emulate. The deterrent effect of her reputation also served as a broader commentary on power dynamics within slavery. The plantation system relied on terror, coercion, and the predictable submission of the enslaved. By making her reputation a force that altered behavior before an act of aggression could occur, she disrupted these dynamics. Masters who might have acted on impulse learned to calculate and hesitate, realizing that not every enslaved woman was a passive instrument of their will. Her reputation challenged assumptions of control and authority, demonstrating that psychological power could rival physical or legal authority even in the most oppressive contexts. Her notoriety, while rooted in fear, also carried an element of empowerment. It allowed her to navigate the plantation with a degree of autonomy rarely afforded to enslaved women. Where most were compelled to submit silently, she moved through her environment with the knowledge that her reputation shielded her from some forms of aggression. This was not a guarantee of safety. Every encounter carried risk, but it provided a protective layer that could be leveraged strategically. In this way, her reputation became both a sword and a shield, a means of asserting power while minimizing vulnerability. Furthermore, the ripple effects of her reputation extended into folklore and collective memory. As word of her deeds spread, she became a symbol not just of defiance but of possibility. To hear her name was to remember that resistance, even in a system designed to erase autonomy, was possible. Masters were deterred, peers were inspired, and history itself began to etch her legend into the consciousness of all who encountered her story. Her reputation transcended immediate survival. It became an enduring cultural artifact, a testament to the power of courage, intelligence, and psychological strategy in the face of systemic oppression. Ultimately, her reputation as a warning exemplifies the intricate interplay of fear, respect, and survival in the plantation context. She transformed acts of self-defense into lasting influence, ensuring that her autonomy was protected not only by her own strength, but by the perception of her invincibility. Her legend demonstrates that, in a world dominated by violence and oppression, psychological mastery and strategic reputation can be as formidable as any weapon. The Oklahoma plantations may have sought to control her body, but her reputation controlled the actions and thoughts of those around her, creating a sphere of authority and influence that few could challenge. In conclusion, the power of her reputation as a warning lies in its dual capacity to protect and intimidate. It was the product of repeated acts of courage, the careful cultivation of perception, and the strategic management of social dynamics. Masters hesitated, peers respected, and her story endured, all because she understood that in a world where every act of aggression carried deadly consequences, the mere knowledge of her ferocity could be enough to deter those who sought to dominate her. Her reputation became both a shield and a weapon, a testament to her intelligence, audacity, and enduring legacy as the most dangerous female slave in Oklahoma. In the oppressive world of Oklahoma plantations, survival demanded more than sheer physical strength or daring acts of defiance. Violence alone could secure temporary safety, but in a system designed to dominate and dehumanize, true autonomy required mastery over the unseen and unspoken forces that shaped behavior. For her, psychological warfare became an essential instrument, a weapon as potent as any whip, chain, or fist. She learned early that fear, perception, and superstition could be manipulated to create influence, deter aggression, and carve out a sphere of independence that transcended the limitations imposed upon enslaved women. The foundations of her psychological strategy lay in understanding the minds of those around her, both masters and fellow captives. She studied their fears, prejudices, and beliefs, noting which superstitions they held, which anxieties they tried to suppress, and which behaviors they considered unassailable. Plantation life was rife with whispers of spirits, curses, and omens, and she tapped into these cultural currents to amplify her presence. By acting in ways that suggested powers beyond the ordinary, she magnified the perception of her invincibility. Masters who might have approached her with expectation of control hesitated when confronted not only by her physical defiance, but by the suggestion that she wielded forces beyond their understanding. The blend of reality and legend became her shield, a psychological boundary that few dared cross. Her manipulation of fear was precise and deliberate. When an overseer or master attempted to assert dominance, she did not simply resist. She orchestrated the confrontation in a manner that left lasting dread. Her movements, expressions, and timing were designed to create uncertainty and unease. An ominous glare, a sudden act of resistance, or even a whispered threat in the dark quarters could convince a would-be aggressor that the risks of engagement far outweighed any potential gain. She understood the human mind, particularly the minds of those accustomed to asserting authority, and used their expectations against them. The resulting fear was not mere reaction. It was a calculated strategic tool that ensured her continued survival and autonomy. Superstition, too, played a central role in her psychological arsenal. In an era when belief in the supernatural was widespread, and the line between legend and reality often blurred, she cultivated an aura that suggested she was protected by forces unseen. Stories of her deeds were recounted in hushed tones, emphasizing her cunning, precision, and the almost uncanny outcomes of her resistance. Rumors suggested that she could curse those who tried to violate her, that misfortune would strike anyone who underestimated her. These tales, while grounded in observation, were amplified by suggestion and fear, creating an atmosphere in which masters second-guessed their actions and captives honored her power. Through the strategic use of superstition, she extended the reach of her influence, making herself untouchable even when absent. The psychological tactics she employed were reinforced by her physical prowess. Each act of self-defense was both a demonstration and a lesson, showing that she could enact swift and decisive consequences. But it was the combination of physicality with mental manipulation that made her strategy so effective. The masters did not merely fear being struck. They feared the unpredictable, the inexplicable, and the possibility that their actions might invoke forces beyond comprehension. By blurring the boundary between reality and legend, she turned superstition into a shield and fear into a deterrent. Her psychological warfare extended to interactions with fellow captives as well. While her reputation inspired awe, she also cultivated a network of silent respect and loyalty. She demonstrated, through actions and subtle cues, who was safe to ally with and who was likely to falter. In doing so, she created an informal hierarchy of influence, where her authority was recognized without the need for coercion. Captives who obeyed the unspoken codes of silence and respect found protection, while those who tested her limits learned caution. In this way, her psychological mastery was both defensive and organizational, shaping the social dynamics of the plantation to her advantage. The effectiveness of her strategy lay in subtlety. She understood that overt displays of power could provoke retaliation from masters or overseers, risking her life. Instead, she relied on suggestion, reputation, and carefully timed actions to manipulate perceptions. A whispered warning, a knowing glance, a minor but memorable act of retaliation, each contributed to an atmosphere in which potential threats were neutralized before they could manifest. Fear became a preemptive barrier, allowing her to navigate the dangerous terrain of plantation life with greater security than brute force alone could provide. Her mastery of psychological warfare also highlights the broader theme of resistance under oppression. The plantation system was designed to enforce submission, stripping enslaved people of autonomy, agency, and dignity. Yet she demonstrated that power could be asserted through intellect and strategy, not just physicality. By manipulating perception, fear, and superstition, she created spaces of influence that challenged the very foundations of the oppressive system. Her survival was a testament to ingenuity, courage, and the understanding that the mind can be as formidable a weapon as the body. The lasting impact of her psychological tactics is evident in how her legend endured. Even decades later, stories of her cunning, her fearlessness, and her ability to manipulate both fear and superstition continued to circulate. Masters learned caution, captives learned respect, and her influence extended far beyond the immediate moments of confrontation. She transformed herself into a symbol of mental acuity and strategic resistance, demonstrating that in a world designed to crush autonomy, intelligence, and psychological insight could create a formidable defense. In conclusion, her psychological warfare exemplifies the multidimensional nature of survival under slavery. She combined physical self-defense with strategic manipulation of fear, superstition, and perception to maintain her autonomy and safety. Her actions were deliberate, calculated, and highly effective, allowing her to navigate a perilous environment while asserting influence over both oppressors and peers. By mastering the human mind as well as her own body, she became untouchable in ways that extended beyond brute force, leaving a legacy of ingenuity, courage, and unmatched psychological mastery in the history of enslaved resistance. In the unforgiving world of Oklahoma plantations, defiance carried consequences that were often swift and brutal. Any act of rebellion could mean death, exile, or sale to a harsher plantation, tearing individuals away from all familiarity and plunging them into even greater suffering. Yet she, the woman whose courage and ferocity had become legendary, defied this grim calculus. She struck back at three masters who sought to assert power over her body, exacting punishment that left them physically and psychologically scarred. Yet she survived each encounter without execution, without sale, and without permanent subjugation. Her ability to escape retribution was not merely luck. It was the result of acute intelligence, strategic foresight, and an almost uncanny understanding of the mechanisms of oppression that surrounded her. The first secret to her survival lay in timing. Each act of retaliation was executed with precision, striking at moments when the master's arrogance rendered them vulnerable and when witnesses were positioned to convey the consequences without providing evidence that could provoke immediate retaliation. She understood the rhythms of plantation life, the movement of overseers, the patterns of labor, the times when the house would be less guarded, and she acted within these windows. Her confrontations were brief, decisive, and calculated, leaving no room for her adversaries to organize a lethal response. In this way, she minimized exposure while maximizing the impact of her actions, ensuring that her defiance could not be easily punished. Yet timing alone was not enough. She also relied on a deep understanding of human psychology. Masters, accustomed to obedience and compliance, were often unprepared for a display of such ferocity from an enslaved woman. Her strikes were not chaotic but deliberate, designed to shock, intimidate, and humiliate without leaving traces that could serve as legal or punitive evidence. By controlling the narrative of each encounter, she ensured that the masters could not fully retaliate without risking their own authority and reputation. In essence, she turned the expectations of power against those who sought to dominate her, demonstrating a level of strategic intelligence that surpassed mere survival instinct. Her resourcefulness extended to social navigation as well. She cultivated a network of discreet allies among the enslaved, individuals who could intervene subtly if necessary, misdirect attention, or provide cover in moments of danger. These alliances were not overtly political but practical, built on mutual understanding and the recognition that her survival could benefit others by deterring masters from unchecked aggression. Through careful observation, she identified who could be trusted and who might betray her, shaping her social environment into a buffer against retribution. Her intelligence lay not only in physical action but in the careful orchestration of relationships, ensuring that she was never isolated at critical moments. Superstition and psychological manipulation also played crucial roles in her survival. She cultivated an aura of danger and unpredictability, making masters hesitant to act against her. Whispers of curses, uncanny foresight, and the lethal precision of her previous actions spread throughout the plantation, creating an environment in which fear constrained aggression. Her reputation became a preemptive shield. Those who might have punished her hesitated, calculating the risks and often choosing inaction over confrontation. This psychological layer of defense was as important as any physical act, allowing her to escape retribution by shaping the perceptions of her oppressors. Each confrontation with a master demonstrated her ability to balance aggression with discretion. She ensured that her retaliatory acts were impactful yet contained, avoiding excessive escalation that might provoke collective punishment or permanent exile. Her intelligence lay in understanding the limits of her environment, how far she could push the boundaries of rebellion without provoking a response that would endanger her life. She measured each strike, each threat, and each display of defiance against the potential consequences, navigating a narrow path between survival and resistance with extraordinary skill. Her ability to avoid being sold was particularly remarkable. Sale to another plantation often served as the ultimate punishment for defiance, severing ties to familiar spaces and increasing vulnerability. Yet she managed to maintain her position on the same plantation, a testament to her strategic thinking. She cultivated relationships that made her survival valuable to the plantation in some form, whether through labor, indispensable skills, or the respect she commanded among other enslaved individuals. By demonstrating that her presence was not only manageable but strategically advantageous, she avoided the extreme punitive measures that might have ended her story prematurely. Moreover, her survival underscores her extraordinary courage. It is one thing to evade punishment through cunning, it is another to repeatedly confront those who hold the power of life and death over you. To strike back at three masters, each presumably stronger, better armed and socially advantaged, required a combination of audacity and precision that few could muster. Each act carried the risk of instant reprisal, yet she balanced that risk against the imperative of defending her body and asserting her autonomy. Her repeated successes reveal not only intelligence, but a relentless commitment to self-preservation in a world designed to eradicate it. Her escape from retribution also amplified her legend. Masters and overseers became cautious in her presence, while fellow captives observed and internalized the lessons of her strategy. Her survival validated her methods, reinforcing the psychological and social barriers that protected her. The combination of timing, cunning, alliances, psychological manipulation, and audacity created a multi-layered defense that allowed her to live unbroken where most would have perished. In conclusion, her ability to escape retribution demonstrates a remarkable intersection of intelligence, strategy, and courage. She understood the mechanics of power, the rhythms of the plantation, and the psychology of both masters and peers. Through careful planning, strategic alliances, and a mastery of both physical and psychological warfare, she navigated a world where defiance often meant death, turning acts of rebellion into a sustainable means of survival. Her legacy as the most dangerous female slave in Oklahoma is inseparable from her skill in escaping the consequences that should have destroyed her. She became not only a figure of fear, but a symbol of the capacity for ingenuity, resilience, and unyielding strength in the darkest of circumstances. In the rigid and brutal hierarchy of Oklahoma plantations, power was assumed to flow in a single direction, from the master, through the overseer, to the enslaved. Every whip, chain, and legal decree reinforced the idea that the enslaved were entirely subordinate, their bodies and labor the property of others. Yet she, the woman whose name would become synonymous with terror and audacity, recognized an uncomfortable truth: power, while enforced, could be observed, manipulated, and, if wielded with cunning, turned against those who sought to dominate. Her acts of defiance did not merely assert her personal autonomy, they systematically subverted the very dynamics of control, creating an environment in which the supposed absolute authority of the masters was undermined by fear, cunning, and strategic resistance. From her first confrontation with a master, she demonstrated an instinct for exploiting the structural vulnerabilities of the plantation system. The tools designed to enforce submission, the overseer's oversight, the isolation of enslaved quarters, the hierarchy of labor, became arenas in which she could exercise agency. She understood the patterns of control when masters were distracted, when guards were inattentive, when fear or superstition could be leveraged, and she used these gaps to assert power in ways that the system had not anticipated. What was intended as a mechanism of oppression became, in her hands, a means of empowerment. Each act of retaliation, each clever avoidance of punishment, chipped away at the assumed invulnerability of her oppressors, proving that the flow of power could be interrupted, if not reversed. Her subversion was not merely physical but psychological. Plantation masters relied on terror and intimidation to maintain dominance, yet she weaponized the same fears against them. By cultivating a reputation for merciless retaliation, she ensured that the threat of consequence preceded any act of aggression. Whispers of her deeds spread, inspiring fear that often prevented an encounter from occurring at all. In this sense, she transformed the expectation of submission into a shield of authority. The master's own system of control became self-limiting. In order to avoid humiliation, injury, or defeat, they were forced to exercise caution, hesitation, and restraint, behaviors previously thought unnecessary. The psychological dynamics of power had been inverted, at least temporarily, in her favor. Physical confrontation, when necessary, further reinforced this inversion. Each master who attempted to violate her body discovered to their horror that the assumptions underpinning their power were false. She struck decisively and without hesitation, turning their arrogance into vulnerability. Her body became both a weapon and a symbol, demonstrating that authority in the plantation was not absolute and that submission could be challenged with strategy and ferocity. These confrontations sent ripples through the plantation, altering the behavior of others and eroding the unquestioned dominance of masters. In effect, she turned the tools of oppression, the very structures designed to immobilize her, into instruments of her own empowerment. Her subversion extended beyond the direct acts of resistance to the social hierarchies within the enslaved community. While fear and respect secured her authority over potential aggressors, it also established her as a figure of influence among fellow captives. Her knowledge, cunning, and demonstrated ability to navigate the dangers of plantation life made her a source of guidance and inspiration. By elevating herself within the social ecosystem, she created a microcosm in which her strategies and survival techniques shaped the behavior of others. In this way, she not only resisted domination, but also created a subtle, parallel system of influence that subverted the totalizing power of the plantation hierarchy. The strategic inversion of power dynamics required both observation and patience. She could not confront every threat head-on. To do so would risk immediate and overwhelming retaliation. Instead, she measured each action, assessing risk, opportunity, and psychological impact. Her intelligence lay in choosing moments that would produce maximum deterrence while preserving her safety. The master's authority, predicated on predictable responses and unquestioned submission, was consistently undermined by her unpredictable defiance. She demonstrated that even the most oppressive systems could be manipulated by those who understood both human behavior and the mechanics of control. Superstition and fear further magnified her ability to subvert authority. The whispered stories of her deeds suggested forces beyond the ordinary, creating hesitation and uncertainty among those who sought to dominate her. Masters began to question their own assumptions, aware that any attempt to exert absolute control could result in unforeseen consequences. By exploiting these psychological gaps, she ensured that the plantation's hierarchy was never entirely stable, that power was contested not just through physical confrontation but through cunning, reputation, and the manipulation of perception. The broader significance of her subversion lies in its demonstration that agency can exist even within the most oppressive systems. She did not merely survive, she reshaped the rules of engagement, using the tools and structures of oppression to carve out spaces of autonomy. By turning fear, superstition, and social networks into mechanisms of control, she challenged the linear assumptions of power, showing that dominance could be resisted and inverted with intelligence and audacity. Her actions became a blueprint for psychological and social resistance, demonstrating that empowerment could emerge even in the most constrained circumstances. Her ability to subvert the dynamics of power left a lasting impression on both oppressors and the oppressed. Masters who might have relied on their assumed authority became cautious, calculating, and hesitant. Fellow captives, witnessing her intelligence and courage, absorbed lessons in strategy, observation, and self-preservation. The psychological and social landscape of the plantation was irrevocably altered. Her name became shorthand for the possibility that the enslaved could assert influence in a world designed to deny them both autonomy and respect. In conclusion, her subversion of power dynamics illustrates a profound understanding of both human behavior and the mechanisms of oppression. By transforming the tools of domination into instruments of empowerment, she inverted the expected flow of authority on the plantation. Physical confrontation, psychological strategy, reputation, and social influence all combined to create a multi-layered resistance that challenged the very foundations of the system in which she lived. Her story demonstrates that even in the darkest circumstances, intelligence, audacity, and strategic manipulation of social and psychological structures can turn oppression into a battleground where the oppressed can assert agency, control, and enduring influence. In the sprawling plantations of Oklahoma, stories were the lifeblood of the enslaved community, carrying warnings, lessons, and memories across generations. Among these tales, none resonated with more potency than hers. The woman who had struck fear into the hearts of 3 masters and survived with cunning and ferocity. Her deeds were extraordinary in both their brutality and their intelligence, and the memory of her resistance transcended her lifetime. She became a living myth, her story whispered across cabins, fields, and eventually villages beyond the plantation. The legend of her ferocity was more than mere storytelling. It was a cultural mechanism of preservation, a cautionary tale, and a beacon of empowerment for those who would come after her. The transmission of her legend began with those who had witnessed her acts of defiance firsthand. Enslaved individuals, aware of the danger of speaking too loudly or revealing details to the wrong ears, spoke of her in hushed tones, emphasizing the lessons her life provided. Each retelling reinforced her intelligence, audacity, and unflinching assertion of autonomy, ensuring that the core of her story remained intact. The narrative of her resistance was shaped not by embellishment alone, but by a keen understanding of its purpose: to inspire caution among oppressors, respect among peers, and vigilance among the next generation. Her legend was constructed as a moral compass for survival within a system designed to destroy it. Her story, however, did not remain confined to the immediate plantation community. As enslaved people moved, were sold, or escaped, the tale traveled with them. Word of her courage and cunning reached distant plantations and settlements, where her name became synonymous with defiance. Even those who had never met her understood the power she wielded through reputation alone. Masters hesitated, aware that the name carried consequences, and the enslaved looked to her story as a blueprint for survival. Through the power of narrative, she transformed from an individual into a symbol, her life and actions embodying the possibility of resistance even in the most oppressive circumstances. The psychological impact of her legend was profound. For the enslaved, it provided a framework for understanding the limits of their own vulnerability. Her story demonstrated that courage, intelligence, and strategic thinking could create a measure of control even within the harshest conditions. Children, who were especially vulnerable to the whims of overseers and masters, were taught to respect her memory and the lessons it embodied. The legend became a tool of moral and practical instruction, illustrating that bravery and cleverness were not merely desirable but essential for survival. In this way, her memory transcended the immediate context of her life, shaping behaviors, expectations, and strategies across generations. For the masters and overseers, the legend served a different but equally potent function. Tales of her defiance circulated quietly, often in the margins of conversations, creating an atmosphere of caution and uncertainty. The psychological weight of her reputation forced even those accustomed to absolute authority to consider the consequences of aggression or underestimation. In this manner, her legend continued to influence power dynamics long after her physical presence had vanished. Fear, respect, and the memory of her strategic cunning became tools she wielded posthumously, extending her influence across time. The folkloric dimension of her story is also notable. Legends often evolve through oral transmission, shaped by the perceptions, fears, and aspirations of the communities that recount them. In her case, the legend emphasized not only her physical prowess, but her intelligence, cunning, and ability to navigate the dangers of plantation life. The acts themselves, terrifying as they were woven into a narrative that highlighted strategy, foresight, and psychological mastery. Her life became a template for how the oppressed could assert agency, teaching lessons that were both practical and symbolic. This transformation from historical figure to legend ensured that her story could endure beyond the fragile lifespan of oral memory and the ephemeral existence of individual slaves. Her legend also played a critical role in reinforcing communal norms and boundaries. By holding her deeds up as an example, communities implicitly taught respect, caution, and strategic thinking. Her life became a warning to those who might exploit or endanger others, emphasizing that actions have consequences, and that intelligence and audacity could counter brute force. In this sense, her legend functioned as both a cultural anchor and a moral guide, providing instruction on how to navigate the oppressive structures of plantation life. The story's persistence through generations underscores the profound psychological and cultural resonance of her life. It was not merely the acts themselves that inspired reverence, but the manner in which she survived, resisted, and transformed the expectations of those around her. Even decades later, children were warned of the dangers of disrespecting her memory, and her name evoked a mixture of fear, respect, and awe. The transmission of her story illustrates the enduring power of narrative as a tool for both survival and empowerment, capable of shaping behaviors and perceptions long after the original events have passed. Moreover, her legend became a symbol of female resistance in a patriarchal system designed to exploit and dominate women. By surviving, retaliating, and manipulating perception, she challenged societal norms that sought to render women powerless. Her story provided a rare template of empowerment, showing that women could assert agency, influence, and authority even under the harshest forms of oppression. The cautionary tales told to children emphasized not only fear, but respect for intelligence, strategy, and moral courage, extending her influence into cultural and generational consciousness. In conclusion, her legend across generations exemplifies the power of narrative to preserve memory, instill caution, and inspire resilience. Through the careful cultivation of her reputation, the strategic execution of her defiance, and the transmission of her story, she became more than an individual. She became a symbol. Her life, acts, and the stories told about her ensured that her influence endured, shaping the behaviors, fears, and aspirations of both the enslaved and free communities for decades. The enduring legend of her courage and intelligence underscores the idea that resistance, even in the most oppressive circumstances, can transcend time, becoming a lasting testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the unyielding pursuit of autonomy. In the brutal and rigid world of Oklahoma plantations, survival required more than just physical strength or cunning. It demanded mastery of perception, intimidation, and reputation. She, the woman whose name became synonymous with terror and audacity, understood this truth better than anyone. By the time she had survived confrontations with 3 masters and orchestrated her own defenses with strategic precision, her presence had become more than that of an individual. It was an embodiment of fear and respect that permeated the plantation. Her actions established a code of conduct not through law, but through the psychological impact of her deeds, ensuring that all who encountered her knew the cost of transgression. Her legacy of fear was first forged through the direct consequences of defiance. Each master who attempted to assert authority over her was met with swift, precise retaliation. The severity and decisiveness of her responses created a palpable unease among those who might otherwise have been emboldened by their social position. It was not merely the acts themselves that inspired fear, but the calculated intelligence with which they were executed. Observers understood that her resistance was neither random nor reckless. It was deliberate, measured, and likely to escalate with potentially lethal consequences. This understanding instilled a deep respect, one born from the recognition that she was a force that could not be ignored. Over time, this fear extended beyond the immediate moments of confrontation. Masters and overseers, aware of her capacity for retaliation, began to approach her with caution, hesitation, and restraint. The very anticipation of her response acted as a deterrent, preventing aggression before it could occur. Her reputation functioned as a preemptive barrier. The threat of her action, real and potent, modified behavior and established boundaries without the need for constant physical enforcement. In this way, fear became a tool, wielded with precision to protect autonomy and assert influence within a system designed to deny both. The impact of her legacy was not confined to those who sought to dominate her. It also shaped interactions among fellow captives. Enslaved individuals, witnessing her intelligence, courage, and strategic mastery, learned to approach her with respect and deference. Her actions established a hierarchy of influence within the enslaved community, one in which fear and respect coexisted. They understood that her authority was absolute, not through formal power structures but through demonstrated capability and strategic acumen. In doing so, she not only protected herself but also influenced the behaviors and decisions of those around her, creating a subtle but undeniable network of social order rooted in her legend. Her use of fear as a tool was deeply intertwined with her psychological insight. She recognized that perception could be as powerful as action. By cultivating a reputation for unpredictability and ruthless precision, she ensured that potential aggressors were constantly assessing the risks of confrontation. Whispers of her past deeds, exaggerated or emphasized by careful storytelling, reinforced this aura of invincibility. Masters learned to anticipate not just the physical retaliation she might enact, but the social and psychological consequences of underestimating her. Her legend became a living mechanism of control, extending her influence beyond the immediate reach of her body. This dual legacy of fear and respect also highlights her mastery of social and psychological dynamics. She balanced aggression with discretion, ensuring that her actions were neither indiscriminate nor reckless. Each act of defiance reinforced her authority while minimizing unnecessary exposure to danger. The respect she commanded was inseparable from the fear she inspired. One without the other would have diminished her ability to assert influence in a volatile environment. By carefully managing the interplay between intimidation and admiration, she created a sustainable framework for autonomy and survival, one that endured even in the face of systemic oppression. Her legacy further demonstrates the enduring power of reputation as a form of protection. While physical strength could secure temporary safety, reputation extended that protection over time and across circumstances. Masters hesitated, overseers recalculated, and fellow captives learned the boundaries of acceptable interaction, all because of the enduring impact of her deeds. The stories told about her, whispered from cabin to cabin, carried lessons that reinforced social norms rooted in fear and respect. In this sense, her legacy became a cultural and psychological instrument, shaping behavior and preserving her influence, long after specific acts of defiance had concluded. The legacy she built was not static. It evolved with each act of strategic defiance. As new masters arrived or overseers rotated, the stories of her ferocity and cunning were recounted, ensuring that her reputation remained current and formidable. Fear was maintained not through constant violence but through the careful curation of her image, the consistency of her defiance, and the intelligence with which she navigated threats. Her ability to sustain this dual legacy of fear and respect demonstrates extraordinary foresight and psychological acuity, qualities that allowed her to survive and assert influence in a context designed to obliterate both. Moreover, her legacy served as a lesson for both oppressors and the oppressed. For masters and overseers, it was a reminder that power was not absolute and that arrogance could be costly. For the enslaved, it was a blueprint for survival, demonstrating that intelligence, courage, and strategic use of fear could create space for autonomy even in the most oppressive conditions. Her story became a moral and practical guide, reinforcing behaviors and attitudes that preserved safety and asserted dignity. In doing so, she transcended the role of individual survivor to become an enduring symbol of resistance and empowerment. In conclusion, her legacy of fear and respect solidified her as a figure whose influence extended far beyond her immediate actions. By combining physical courage with psychological mastery, strategic timing, and careful reputation management, she ensured that all who encountered her, masters, overseers, and fellow captives alike, approached her with a mixture of fear and admiration. Her legacy illustrates the profound interplay between action and perception, demonstrating that survival in a system designed to annihilate autonomy requires more than strength. It requires intelligence, foresight, and the ability to shape the beliefs and behaviors of others. In the end, she became not only a survivor but a legend, her story enduring as a testament to the power of fear, respect, and unyielding courage in the face of overwhelming oppression. In the harsh, sun-beaten fields and shadowed quarters of Oklahoma's plantations, survival was often measured in days rather than decades. The lives of enslaved women were subjected to constant scrutiny, coercion, and abuse, and the odds of asserting any meaningful autonomy were slim. Yet she, whose name would later be whispered in fear and reverence, defied those odds with unparalleled courage and ingenuity. Her life was a continuous exercise in resistance, a deliberate orchestration of defiance and strategy that allowed her to navigate an environment designed to suppress agency and enforce absolute control. In this sense, her story is not only a tale of survival but a testament to the power of human resilience and the capacity to claim space even under the most oppressive conditions. Her triumph began with understanding the nature of the oppression she faced. She recognized early that brute strength alone would not ensure survival, it would only provoke retaliation that could prove fatal. Instead, she cultivated a multifaceted approach that combined physical defiance, psychological manipulation, and strategic alliances. By striking at moments of vulnerability, exploiting the fears and superstitions of her masters, and cultivating a network of discreet allies among fellow captives, she created a protective sphere of influence that few could penetrate. Every act of defiance was calculated, ensuring that her autonomy was preserved without inviting overwhelming reprisal. The acts themselves were legendary. When confronted by three masters who sought to assert control over her body, she retaliated with precision and decisiveness, leaving an indelible mark on their minds and bodies. Each confrontation was a careful study in timing, observation, and impact. She struck in ways that maximized effect while minimizing risk, ensuring that her defiance carried consequences, but not her own demise. These acts were not mere rebellion, they were a strategic assertion of her rights, a declaration that her body, her choices, and her dignity could not be violated without consequence. In doing so, she redefined the boundaries of power on the plantation. Her triumph was reinforced by her mastery of psychological warfare. By cultivating fear and respect, she ensured that her reputation preceded her, creating an invisible barrier against potential aggressors. Masters hesitated, overseers recalculated, and fellow captives treated her with deference and admiration. Stories of her courage spread far and wide, ensuring that her influence extended beyond immediate encounters. Her ability to manipulate perception, to turn fear into a protective force, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of human behavior and the dynamics of oppression. In essence, she created a form of power that could not be fully contained, measured, or destroyed. Her cunning was also evident in her strategic navigation of the social environment of the plantation. She cultivated alliances, both subtle and overt, among those who could offer assistance or act as buffers in moments of danger. These alliances were not born of servility but of mutual recognition. Survival often depended on cooperation, discretion, and the careful management of information. Through this network, she ensured that her actions were supported and that her autonomy was safeguarded. Her social intelligence, combined with her physical and psychological prowess, allowed her to maneuver within a system designed to trap and crush her. Perhaps most remarkable was her ability to sustain this autonomy over time. Survival in the short term might require a single act of defiance, but her triumph lay in her enduring influence. She was not destroyed, sold, or broken, despite the severity of her actions and the number of powerful men she confronted. Instead, she continued to navigate the plantation with a measure of freedom that few enslaved women could claim. Her resilience demonstrates not only courage but strategic patience, an understanding that survival and empowerment were achieved incrementally, through careful planning, observation, and execution. Her triumph was also a cultural phenomenon. The stories of her defiance, cunning, and intelligence became legendary, passed down through whispers, tales, and memories across generations. For enslaved communities, she became an emblem of the possibility of agency, a proof that even within the most brutal systems, autonomy could be asserted and defended. Her life provided lessons not only in survival but in the strategic use of fear, intelligence, and timing. Through her actions, she left a cultural legacy that would inform the behaviors, expectations, and aspirations of countless others long after her own life had ended. The significance of her triumph extends beyond individual survival. In a world structured to deny enslaved women control over their bodies, labor, and choices, she asserted an unprecedented level of autonomy. Her success challenged assumptions about power, dominance, and gender within the plantation system. By surviving, resisting, and outmaneuvering those who sought to dominate her, she carved a space that was uniquely her own, a rare assertion of agency that defied the oppressive structures of her time. Moreover, her legacy serves as a historical testament to resilience and defiance. The courage she exhibited in confronting injustice, the intelligence with which she navigated danger, and the foresight she applied to preserve her autonomy collectively represent an extraordinary achievement. Her life demonstrates that even in the most constrained and violent systems, individuals can assert control, influence perception, and leave a lasting mark on history. Her triumph is therefore both personal and symbolic. It is the story of one woman's survival and the enduring proof of human ingenuity under oppression. In conclusion, her triumph of defiance illustrates the power of courage, intelligence, and strategic action in the face of overwhelming adversity. By combining physical skill, psychological mastery, and social acumen, she survived repeated attempts at subjugation, created a reputation that shielded her from harm, and asserted a level of autonomy unparalleled for enslaved women. Her actions transformed her from a captive into a legend, leaving a lasting mark on history and the collective memory of those who witnessed, heard of, or later recounted her deeds. The story of her triumph is a dark, haunting, and inspiring testament to the capacity of the human spirit to resist, endure, and prevail, even in the most oppressive circumstances imaginable. As the dust settled over the relentless fields of Oklahoma, her story remained, an unbroken thread of defiance woven into the fabric of history. The woman who had struck fear into 3 masters, who had outwitted every overseer who dared approach her, and who had turned the very instruments of oppression into shields for her survival, left behind more than legend. She left a legacy of courage, cunning, and unyielding autonomy that defied the cruel mechanics of a system built to erase her existence. To understand her life is to understand not only the brutality of slavery, but also the extraordinary capacity for human resilience in the face of relentless adversity. The plantation, like countless others in the South, sought to impose a rigid hierarchy, a chain of power that stretched from master to slave with no room for resistance. Yet she defied this structure repeatedly. Each act of retaliation, each manipulation of fear, each whispered story passed between cabins served as a testament that authority could be challenged. Her presence on the plantation was not merely physical, it was psychological, social, and moral. She transformed fear into power, superstition into a shield, and reputation into a force as protective as any chain or whip. Even masters, men who had lived their lives believing themselves untouchable, were forced to reckon with her audacity. Her survival, remarkable in its own right, was amplified by her intelligence and strategic thinking. She understood that courage without calculation could be fatal. Every confrontation was carefully orchestrated, every alliance selectively nurtured, every rumor of her deeds deliberately amplified. By doing so, she created a protective sphere around herself, ensuring that those who sought to harm her hesitated. Her defiance was not chaotic, it was methodical, precise, and terrifyingly effective. The very tools intended to subjugate her, the hierarchy of masters and overseers, the fear of punishment, the violence inherent in the system, were turned into instruments of her empowerment. Her legacy did not end with her immediate survival. Stories of her courage and cunning spread, carried on the lips of enslaved people, and later memorialized in folklore. Her name became synonymous with fear and respect, a cautionary emblem to both oppressors and the oppressed. Children were warned in hushed tones not to disrespect her memory, masters learned caution in their dealings, and fellow captives drew inspiration from the possibilities she had demonstrated. In this way, she became more than a historical figure. She became a symbol, a guide for how intelligence, bravery, and strategic defiance could carve out a measure of autonomy even in the darkest of circumstances. Her triumphs also speak to the broader human capacity for resistance. She demonstrated that survival was not merely about enduring hardship, but about asserting agency in the face of systemic oppression. By carefully calibrating her actions, she ensured that her defiance had enduring impact, influencing behavior and perception in ways that extended far beyond her immediate environment. Her psychological mastery, her cultivation of reputation, and her ability to manipulate both fear and superstition allowed her to exist in a space that few others could, partially free even while technically enslaved. In examining her story, we are reminded that history often overlooks the agency of the oppressed, particularly women. Her actions challenge the narratives that portray enslaved women solely as passive victims. She was neither passive nor submissive. She was audacious, intelligent, and unyielding. Her capacity to resist physically, socially, and psychologically positions her not only as a survivor, but as a trailblazer, a figure whose courage illuminated the possibilities for autonomy and empowerment even within the most oppressive systems. The lasting resonance of her legend lies in its multidimensional impact. Masters feared her, overseers approached her with caution, and fellow captives learned respect. Fear became a mechanism of protection, intelligence a weapon, and her reputation a shield. The plantation itself, designed to suppress agency, became a stage on which she demonstrated that autonomy could be claimed with skill, courage, and foresight. She redefined the boundaries of what was possible for an enslaved woman, leaving a mark on history that cannot be erased. Her story is not merely about survival, it is about transformation. She transformed fear into power, vulnerability into strategy, and oppression into opportunity. Each act of defiance, each calculated decision, contributed to a broader narrative of resistance that would endure long after her lifetime. Her legacy is a reminder that even under extreme oppression, individuals can assert control, shape perception, and influence the behavior of others. It is a story of empowerment, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of self-determination. For modern readers, her tale serves as both a cautionary reflection and a source of inspiration. It illuminates the dark realities of slavery, while highlighting the extraordinary ways in which human beings can resist domination. Her intelligence, courage, and strategic mastery offer lessons in resilience, psychological insight, and the power of reputation. Her story challenges us to reconsider assumptions about power, vulnerability, and agency, demonstrating that, even in the harshest conditions, autonomy and influence can be claimed. In closing, the woman known as the most dangerous female slave in Oklahoma achieved something remarkable. She survived, she resisted, and she left an enduring mark on history. Her courage and cunning transformed fear into a tool, oppression into opportunity, and survival into legend. Her life demonstrates that resistance is not only a matter of physical endurance, but also of psychological mastery, strategic thinking, and the ability to navigate complex social dynamics. Through her actions, she carved a space for autonomy where none was expected, creating a legacy that continues to resonate as a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and defiance in the face of impossible odds. Her story endures because it embodies the ultimate triumph of spirit over oppression, intelligence over brute force, and defiance over fear. It is a story of survival that transcends time, a dark and haunting tale that continues to inspire, terrify, and command respect. In remembering her, we honor not only her courage but the enduring power of those who refuse to be silenced, controlled, or broken by the harshest circumstances. Her legacy is etched into history, a lasting reminder that even in the darkest hours, human ingenuity, courage, and determination can prevail.